Tapper.
This is CNN Breaking News.
And welcome to The Lead. I'm Jake Tapper. We're beginning with the breaking news. You're seeing on your screen, U.S. Secret Service says a car has hit a barricade at one of the security checkpoints near the White House. The woman driving the car, we're told, is in custody, the Secret Service says. Sources tell CNN they do not believe this was directed toward the president or anyone at the White House. CNN's Ryan Nobles is at the White House. Ryan, authorities do say, however, this was intentional.
Yeah, that's right, Jake, and that's probably the most significant bit of information that we've been able to pick up from our sources here in the past half hour or so. That's when we first started to receive word of this vehicle that had rammed into a barricade on 17th and E, which is just on the other side of the old Eisenhower Executive Office building, which is the building in between the White House and 17th Street. There was a scramble of Secret Service officers over to that location at that time. The woman was quickly taken into custody, and as you report, Jake, we're being told that this was an intentional move on behalf of this woman and that this was someone who was known by the U.S. Secret Service, someone that they had had some sort of prior contact with. And they also believe that there may be some sort of mental health issue at play in this incident. Now, it has shut down traffic for only about a very short block between on 17th Street there by the White House, but they haven't really expanded the security perimeter all that much. They've been allowing journalists to come in and out of the White House grounds here for the past half hour or so, so it doesn't appear that the security situation here is at a high level. We should point out, though, Jake, that at this present moment, the Prime Minister of Australia, who was here for a meeting with the President of the United States and did hold a press conference, was still in the West Wing. And there were journalists, Australian journalists, covering his visit who were held here at the White House while this incident was being hashed out. So just to recap, this woman now in custody, someone known to Secret Service. It's believed that she did ram her vehicle into that barricade on 17th and E Street just outside the White House on purpose. But at this point, no law enforcement personnel were injured. And it's also believed, Jake, that this woman was not targeting the President of the United States or anyone inside the White House. Jake?
All right, Ryan Nobles at the White House. We're obviously going to continue to monitor the situation at the White House, though we are, of course, grateful that it appears everyone is okay. Let us turn now, however, to the politics lead in today's major developments in Robert Mueller's Russia investigation, revealing how wide the scope and how long the reach the probe seems to have. Today, former Trump campaign aide Rick Gates gave in to pressure and just moments ago pleaded guilty to charges of conspiracy and charges of lying to the FBI. Gates is now the fifth person to plead guilty in Mueller's probe, and this one could theoretically be a major turning point if Gates begins to cooperate with Mueller's team. Also worth noting, today's plea deal came just one day after Mueller levied 32 charges against both Gates and his close business partner, Paul Manafort, who is, of course, Trump's former campaign chairman. President Trump, who has called the Russia investigation a witch hunt in the past, today would not say a word when reporters shouted questions about Gates today.
Any concerns about Gates? Mr. President, any concerns about Rick Gates?
Thank you very much.
Concerns about Rick Gates?
Thank you,
CNN's Sarah Murray has the rest of the story.
Former Trump campaign advisor Rick Gates telling friends and family in a letter that the last several months have been excruciating. He pleaded guilty to 2 criminal charges today, conspiracy to defraud the U.S. and making false statements, according to court filings. Gates is cooperating with the special counsel, which makes him the 3rd Trump associate known to be cooperating with Mueller's investigation. His decision to flip on his longtime business partner, Paul Manafort, who served as the Trump campaign chairman, also ramps up the pressure on Manafort to cooperate with Mueller, particularly about the campaign.
I think these lawyers are putting so much pressure on these guys with so many high stakes that the ultimate decision is going to be, I've got to protect myself and my family, and they're going to cooperate.
Both Gates and Manafort pleaded not guilty in October to financial charges unrelated to the campaign. But in the charges Gates has now pleaded to, prosecutors outline how the 2 business partners hid millions of dollars from their Ukrainian lobbying work from the federal government, and then lied to federal investigators in 2016 about the scheme. Investigators also caught Gates in a lie during an interview in plea negotiations earlier this month, according to court filings. He lied in saying Ukraine was not discussed during a 2013 meeting in Washington with Manafort. Lobbying disclosures show California Congressman Dana Rohrabacher, a Russia-friendly member of Congress, also attended. In a letter to associates, Gates describes his decision to plead guilty as a change of heart. The reality of how long this legal process will take, the cost, and the circus-like atmosphere of an anticipated trial are too much, Gates writes. On Thursday, Mueller unveiled a set of new charges in Virginia, 18 counts against Manafort and 23 against Gates, in addition to the counts the pair were already facing in D.C. federal court. The new charges carry the risk of a far longer prison sentence, up to 30 years for each of them if found guilty of bank fraud. The move highlights how Mueller's team is turning up the heat on former Trump campaign officials to press them to cooperate. Their cooperation, building blocks Mueller can potentially use in a case against other Trump associates or even the president. The pressure took its toll on Gates, who lives with his wife and 4 children in Richmond, Virginia, and allegedly used millions of dollars from offshore accounts for expenses like his mortgage, children's tuition, and interior decorating. In explaining the plea deal to friends, Gates writes, "The consequence is the public humiliation, which at this moment seems like a small price to pay for what our children would have to endure otherwise."
Now today, Paul Manafort is maintaining his innocence in a very pointed statement. Here's what he had to say. "I had hoped and expected my business colleague would have had the strength to continue the battle to prove our innocence. For reasons yet to surface, he chose to do otherwise. This does not alter my commitment to defend myself against the untrue piled up charges contained in the indictments against me." Jake.
All right, Sarah Murray, thanks so much. Let's bring in my political panel and start with CNN chief legal analyst Jeffrey Toobin. Jeffrey, how much does the Gates guilty plea from this afternoon put pressure on Manafort? Do you think it's likely that Manafort will strike a plea deal with Mueller?
I think it is going to be almost impossible for Paul Manafort to go to trial if Rick Gates is a witness against him, which he clearly now will be. If you look at the charging instrument, the document to which Rick Gates pled guilty today, virtually every paragraph has Paul Manafort's name in it. Everything that Gates did is admitting to Manafort did and worse. Now, certainly he can argue, and he will argue if this case goes to trial, that Gates is just making it up. He's just trying to get a lighter sentence. But this is a very document-heavy case. This is a case about abundant offshore bank accounts, how Paul Manafort could explain those while Gates is saying this whole thing was a corrupt enterprise, I think is almost impossible. And I think the odds of Manafort now pleading guilty and cooperating just went way, way up.
And what's interesting also is there's been a lot of talk about how the charges against Gates and Manafort don't have anything to do with collusion with Russia, don't have anything to do with the campaign. And yet, you look in this document, court documents show Gates lied this month to the FBI about a meeting in 2013. Gates said Ukraine was not discussed in the meeting, but the FBI and the Justice Department say it was. Also in that meeting, California Congressman Dana Rohrabacher and former Congressman Vin Weber, who's now a D.C. lobbyist. Rohrabacher, obviously one of the most Russia-friendly lawmakers on Capitol Hill. This does add to the mystique of this, Garrett.
It does. And one of the things that's very significant in this is that Rick Gates pleaded guilty to conspiracy today, conspiracy against the United States, which is significant legally because now Bob Mueller can take anyone who knew about this, anyone who knew about the scheme that he had been planning with Paul Manafort.
The money laundering scheme.
The money laundering scheme. Anyone who abetted it, anyone who helped it, anyone who knew about it and didn't report it, and can instantly and easily charge them with conspiracy as well. And what you see both in this indictment and plea today, as well as the indictment against the Internet Research Agency last Friday, is Bob Mueller is beginning to set down the building blocks of conspiracies that can point towards future indictments.
Well, and you just raised the point that people are saying that this has nothing to do with the Trump campaign, but consider what Rick Gates knows. He had a significant role in the campaign. He was the deputy campaign chairman, and even after Paul Manafort left in August of 2016, he remained on as a liaison between the campaign and the Republican National Committee, and he stayed traveling with them until the election day. So he certainly played a big role. He was there during significant policy decisions. He was there during a lot of their outreach on social media and whatnot. So he likely knows a lot about the fundamentals of the Trump campaign. So that's what you have to keep in mind is we don't know everything that Bob Mueller knows about what Rick Gates knows.
And also keep in mind that I'll come to you in one second, but just one other point, Jeffrey, which is we also, I'll keep in mind also that Paul Manafort was present in that meeting at Trump Tower with the Russian lawyer who had been sold to the Trump campaign and Donald Trump Jr. as having damaging information on Hillary Clinton.
He was at that meeting, and if you look at the charging document to which Gates pleaded guilty, the conspiracy to which he pleaded guilty continued throughout all the time that he was working on the Trump campaign. Now, it is not a conspiracy to collude, to work with the Russians directly related to the campaign, but here you have a senior official in the Trump campaign admitting that he was involved in a criminal conspiracy while he was working on the Trump campaign. That is potentially very serious. And his agreement to cooperate means he has to tell absolutely everything he knows, both about the criminal conspiracy to which he pleaded guilty and anything else that he's aware of.
We also have to point out how close he is to Paul Manafort. I mean, he is his right-hand man. They've worked together for decades. They are very close. So maybe Rick Gates was not at that meeting at Trump Tower, but it's highly unlikely that he and Paul Manafort never discussed something as significant as that. So that's what you have to keep in mind. And that's why this could potentially be a big blow to whatever Paul Manafort's defense is compared to what Rick Gates tells the special counsel.
Something else interesting happened today that may or may not have anything to do with the Russia probe. President Trump was asked if he would grant a special waiver for his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, who's a senior advisor. And here is what President Trump's response was. Jared Kushner obviously has had some difficulty getting security clearance.
Jared's done an outstanding job. I think he's been treated very unfairly. He's a high-quality person. I will let General Kelly make that decision, and he's going to do what's right for the country, and I have no doubt he'll make the right decision.
Here's the subtext of all of this. Chief of Staff John Kelly set a deadline of today to stop interim security clearances for aides with pending investigations since June of last year. And, of course, there is a lot of tension, Caitlin, between Chief of Staff Kelly and Jared Kushner.
Tension is putting it lightly. Even though Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump originally pushed for John Kelly to become the chief of staff, they thought that he was going to impose this restraint on the West Wing, and they didn't realize how much it would apply to them. And it is greatly applied to them because not only has John Kelly tried to limit Jared Kushner's portfolio, he's also been pretty dismissive of Ivanka Trump as well. So this move to change the security clearance process, a lot saw it as a direct affront on Jared Kushner himself because he was the most known person for having a security clearance issue before the Rob Porter scandal broke out. So a lot of people saw this as a direct affront on him. And people even said that people were worried to raise questions about Rob Porter's clearance issues because they knew it would resurrect the scrutiny that surrounded Jared Kushner's as well. So it could be a showdown between John Kelly and Jared Kushner here because John Kelly or Jared Kushner's fate essentially lies in John Kelly's hands
the president
from this point
just
on.
Put it there. And Garrett, one of the other things we know is that the Robert Mueller probe, they're looking at Kushner's activities, including financing he tried to get after the election while he was on the presidential transition team, and simultaneously was the conduit for foreign governments trying to reach President Trump, President-elect Trump at the time.
Absolutely. And one, we talk a lot about this investigation and the Mueller probe as a Russia probe, but part of what we're beginning to see sort of hints of in this expanding probe into Jared Kushner and his business dealings during the transition is actually a China angle. And that's sort of something that we're beginning to sort of see some reporting. CNN this week breaking some new ground on that's been previously broken and sort of opened up by the Wall Street Journal and the New Yorker. So it seems entirely possible that Jared might have both a Russia problem and a China problem relating to his security clearance.
And the reason people have raised so many questions about him having an interim security clearance and having all this access to highly classified information is because he not only reads the daily brief that the president gets, that the president doesn't always read, we found out. Jared Kushner reads it, gets briefed on it by someone at the CIA, but he's also been one of the top White House officials who's requested more classified information than anyone else. So he's going to go from having all this access to having zero access after this to that highly classified info.
Jeff, final thought? Yeah.
Well, yeah, it's that this is why companies have rules against nepotism. You don't have your son-in-law work in the White House because you can't treat him like everyone else. If he were a normal employee, he'd be out on his behind a while ago because he doesn't have a security clearance. Now he's in charge of Middle East peace negotiations with no security clearance. It's just a preposterous situation because he's the president's son-in-law.
Thanks, one and all. Appreciate it. Our President Trump's thoughts on gun law is already changing from just a couple days ago. Don't go anywhere. We're back with our politics lead. Throughout the day, President Trump has been promising to make changes to try to prevent another school shooting. But one of the proposals he was touting yesterday, he is not talking about today. Let's bring back CNN's Ryan Nobles at the White House. And Ryan, the president's allies have told him to simmer down about specific policy proposals to address school shootings. Is he listening?
Well, Jake, judging by how the president spoke about that issue today, that may be the case. And for a moment today, campaign Donald Trump was back in full form. But it did not take long for the president to once again be confronted with the realities of his office and the big issues facing his administration, specifically what he's going to do about guns in America. The president promising action on guns. Depending on the audience, though, his focus seemed to change. With Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, a country that has strict gun laws on the books, the president talked about his plan to curb access to guns and strengthen security at schools.
We want to be very powerful, very strong on background checks, and especially as it pertains to the mentally ill. We're going to get rid of the bump stocks, and we're going to do certain other things.
But earlier in the day, in front of CPAC, he touted his support for gun rights.
They'll take away your Second Amendment, which we will never allow to happen. They'll take away your Second Amendment.
That speech turned out to be the president playing his greatest campaign hits, abandoning his planned script within minutes.
By the way, you don't mind if I go off script a little bit, because, you know, it's sort of boring.
Advisors touted the speech ahead of time as an opportunity for Mr. Trump to roll out tougher new sanctions on North Korea. Something he did do, but briefly, and almost as an addendum to his fiery remarks.
That just was announced, and I want to let you know.
Instead, he hammered Hillary Clinton. And took a subtle jab at fellow Republican John McCain's vote on health care, albeit not by name.
I don't want to be controversial, so I won't use his name, okay? What a mess.
But both at CPAC and at his news conference, he conveniently avoided talk of his new tougher position on guns, like raising the minimum age for purchase of firearms to 21, a position that breaks with the NRA.
Mr. President, are you concerned that your positions on gun control break from the NRA?
And while the White House seems inclined to do something about guns, the president is still sticking close to gun rights supporters, emphasizing his push for arming teachers and blaming the law enforcement response to the shooting in Florida, specifically the deputy on duty at the time of the shooting.
Frankly, you had a gun, and he was outside as a guard, and he decided not to go in. That was not his finest moment, that I can tell you. A security guard doesn't know the children, doesn't love the children. This man standing outside of the school the other day doesn't love the children, probably doesn't know the children. The teachers love their children.
And one other bit of news that came out of that joint press conference today, the president was pressed about the lack of a security clearance for one of his top advisors and son-in-law, Jared Kushner. The president said while he appreciates the work that Kushner is doing and he praised him in general, he said he would defer the ultimate decision on Kushner's future to his chief of staff, John Kelly. Jake?
All right, Ryan Nobles, thank you so much. My political panel joins me now for more. I want to start with his comments from the president this afternoon about, and he wasn't a security guard. He was a sheriff's deputy assigned to the school, had been there for several years, was known and liked by people at the school. Scott Peterson, he has since resigned. The president said, quote, a security guard doesn't know the children, doesn't love the children. This man standing outside of the school the other day doesn't love the children, probably doesn't know the children. The teachers love their children. He's using that as a way of talking about how teachers should be trained and armed as opposed to a security guard, although, again, it wasn't a security guard, it was a deputy sheriff.
Yeah, it's another way to support his idea. This has been the biggest proposal he's pushed since he first met with those students and teachers at the White House on Wednesday, those that had survived the shooting. His idea is now arming teachers with guns, and he's been pushing it pretty heavily. He floated the other ideas, the background checks, raising the minimum age to purchase a firearm to 21, but arming teachers has been his big thing. He wants to arm about 20% of teachers. He wants them to have concealed carry. He wants them to get bonuses for having those. And he used that argument today, saying they would care more, essentially, if there was a shooting, and that they would try to protect the students more. But that's obviously not proven, but he's using it from this case to make that argument.
Paul, what do you make of, look, the Broward County Sheriff's Office is getting a lot of criticism, and I'm not going to defend them. That's for them to do. And we're going to have some reporting on that later in the show. But what do you make of the president singling out the deputy sheriff who didn't run into the building as he should have, as was his job?
Right, that was his job, and I think everybody who hears about that, I mean, we saw that the sheriff was just heartbroken when he revealed that, and I thought he was very candid, very transparent, and very angry and heartbroken, and I think we all are, and the president reflects that. I do think as a general matter, presidents should hold back until they get all the facts, and this is what's interesting about our president. Let me praise him. Here's the best thing about Donald Trump. He doesn't drink, because he is the drunkest sober guy I've ever seen in my life. He's just this crackpot on a bar stool, just popping off. Well, teachers will be better shots than cops because school researchers don't love them. That's like, you know, what your drunk Uncle Wally says. But I'm so glad he doesn't drink, and because, good Lord, if this is what he's like when he has access to all the facts, all the research, all the best experts, ask the cops, ask the teachers, ask the experts. He's got them all right there at his fingertips, and yet he just pops off like a drunk at a bar.
Joseph, it looks like you want to say something.
Look, I think that first and foremost, particularly in communities of color, you're talking about trying to end the prison to school school to prison pipeline. You know, I think that, you know, when you start talking about the rise of things like Black Lives Matter, you haven't seen civil unrest until you see a student killed by a teacher in a school because they were shot in the interest of safety because they felt uncomfortable, because they felt scared. And so this whole notion that somehow the children will be safer because you're going to arm the teachers because the teachers care more. We have teachers right now, even at this school, that laid down their lives for those students.
Yeah.
You know, these teachers already are going above and beyond the call, and we are clearly not giving them nearly enough support. What we should be talking about is doing things like having a new approach in law enforcement, talking about having mental health embedded in our local police departments. You know, you talk about, 30 years ago, 20 years ago, there was no such thing as a special victims unit. We thought it was unwise uses of expenditures. You know, fast forward today, we recognize it is a best practice for police work and also makes it easier for us to solve those crimes. So those are the types of innovative things that we should be talking about as a society if our true goal is to actually make people safer, not this notion of arming teachers who are already doing what's best for the students.
Well, and the White House has been unable to answer specifics of how they would even carry something like that out, because a lot of teachers have trouble even getting like dry erase markers, for example. How are you going to give them a weapon? Who's going to train them? How do you decide which teachers? Because the president has floated this idea of having ex-military people. He said people like the Chief of Staff, John Kelly, a 4-star Marine general, should be people like that in schools that are armed there to protect the children. But there aren't a ton of 4-star Marine generals that are out looking for teaching jobs. So the White House has not been able to answer specifics of how this would even be carried out. How would this be regulated? How would they be taught? Which teachers would be selected? Who's going to pay to arm 700,000, maybe 1 million teachers with guns across the United States? So even those questions.
And even cops who are highly trained, cops who qualify on a range, hitting their target 90% of the time on the range. When they're in an officer-involved shooting, studies indicate that 70 to 80% of the shots that officers take miss. Maybe they hit a bystander, maybe they miss the perpetrator. So if the cops who are trained are missing 70 to 80% of the shots that they take in the active shooter situation, how many times is the English teacher going to miss? It's just unwise.
The president did seem to be, I don't know if he's backing away from it, but he's not discussing today, and maybe we're reading too much into it, raising the minimum age for purchase for non-military purchasers of guns from 18 to 21. He talked about that a great deal, and today he didn't. Do you think he's backing away from it?
I don't think he's backing away from it. I think that, unfortunately, I think what the president struggles with is the fact that people outside of the room can hear what you're saying. And so you go to CPAC and you're saying things that obviously gets the crowd excited, but it's being broadcast around the world. Even when we start talking about trade tariffs and things of that nature, the other countries can also hear you. And so I think that the difficulty is not that the president doesn't intend to do something on guns, because I really do believe that we will get something done this time, because I think this time is different. But I think this notion that somehow you can have a different message for every audience in the interest of trying to keep everybody happy makes it very difficult for us in this public sphere to try to decipher what's actually going to happen.
And Caitlin, your reporting indicates that some of the president's allies have been cautioning him, don't get bogged down in the specifics. Just talk about, in generalities, what you want to do, because obviously this is going to have to be done on Capitol Hill.
Well, there's a concern that he will get spun up from these emotional cable appearances from these survivors, and there are so many gun control advocates out there right now making these arguments for gun control measures. So those close to the president are worried that he could get into that and get ensnared in that and then go a little too far. So they've said, hey, you've done enough with these proposals that you've already floated so far. There's no need to go any further, because they're worried he's going to antagonize his gun rights base that voted him into office. So that could certainly be a reason he's not bringing up the minimum gun age, because that's something that is roundly rejected by the NRA, officials that the president has been speaking to from the NRA in recent days. And it's also something that's usually rejected by a lot of Second Amendment endorser advocates. So that's certainly something that could be on the president's mind here.
Paul, you were with Bill Clinton during the Clinton era when the last time that any gun restrictions, or at least serious ones, were passed. The Brady bill, the ban on so-called assault weapons, et cetera, which has since expired. Does this moment feel like that to you, or do you think that we're all kind of getting swept up in the emotion of what happened in Parkland, but ultimately probably nothing major is going to happen?
I think the politics on guns are even more toxic now than it was then. We had a terrific ally in passing the Brady bill in Ronald Reagan. You know, he was retired.
And Gerald Ford also.
And President Ford, who had been shot at twice, attempted assassinations twice. They helped, President Reagan's imprimatur on that helped enormously. And yet, after that, we suffered a landslide defeat. But one of the NRA talking points is that assault weapon ban that we passed, that we had for 10 years, it didn't have any effect. There was a Justice Department study. They said anything conclusive, but no great effect. But on mass shootings, it did. And this is what assault weapons are used for, mass shootings. They're not used in most crimes. They're just not. That's handguns. But these assault weapons, the 10 years before the assault weapon ban came in, 155 people were killed in mass shootings, shootings that involved 5 people or more. The 10 years we had it, it dropped from 155 to 89. And then the 10 years after it expired, it jumped up from 89 to 302. The president could make a difference here the way Ronald Reagan did. President Trump, we said this a day after this massacre, this president could save hundreds and hundreds of lives and stop a lot of mass shootings by doing what Ronald Reagan did, come out for an assault weapon ban.
All right, everyone stick around. We have a big report coming up, new and shocking reporting about what 3 Broward County deputies actually did when they arrived at the Stoneman Douglas campus. That's next. According to sources in Coral Springs, Florida, it was not just Broward County Sheriff's Deputy Scott Peterson who did not go into Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School on Wednesday during the shooting crisis and in the aftermath of the massacre that killed 17 students and teachers. Sources tell me that Coral Springs police officers who arrived on the scene were surprised to find 3 other Broward County Sheriff's deputies also outside the school. They had not entered the school. The deputies, these sources say, had their pistols drawn and they were behind their vehicles having taken cover. Not one of them had gone into the school. With direction from the Broward deputies who were outside, Coral Springs police soon started entering the building where the shooter was thought to be. New Broward County Sheriff's deputies arrived on the scene. 2 of those deputies and an officer from local Sunrise, Florida, joined the Coral Springs police as they all went into the building to try to help the kids and teachers. Some Coral Springs police were stunned and upset that as they went in, the 4 original Broward County Sheriff's deputies who were first on the scene did not appear to join them as they entered the school, sources tell me. What these Coral Springs officers observed, though not their feelings about it, will be released in a report likely next week. Now, sources cautioned me that tapes are currently being reviewed and official accounts could ultimately differ from the recollections of the officers on the scene. The Broward County Sheriff's Office did not return multiple requests for comment today. It's unclear whether the shooter was still in the building when Coral Springs police arrived. Things may have reached a boiling point in this confrontation the night after the shooting on February 15th, where at a vigil in front of dozens of others, Coral Springs City Manager Mike Goodrum confronted Broward County Sheriff Scott Israel. A source familiar with the conversation tells me that Goodrum was upset that the Broward deputies had remained outside the school while kids inside could have been bleeding out, among other reasons. Goodrum said in a statement to CNN, quote, "Given the horrific events of that day, emotions were running high, and the sheriff and I had a heated moment following the following evening. Sheriff Israel and I have spoken several times since, and I can assure you that our departments have a good working relationship and the utmost respect for each other." Goodrum declined to tell me about the content of their confrontation. 2 days after the shooting, we should note, Coral Springs Police Chief Tony Postizzi addressed some of the concerns voiced by his officers in an internal email obtained by CNN that said, among other items, quote, "I understand that another agency has given the impression that it had provided the majority of the rescue efforts and that the tremendous work of the Coral Springs Police and Fire Departments has not been recognized. Please know that this issue will be addressed and the truth will come out in time." I want to bring in CNN's Rosa Flores, who's in Parkland, Florida, for us. And Rosa, you talked to a source who witnessed officers standing outside as this was all happening. What did you hear?
You know, this source described it as a very frustrating situation, Jake, as you mentioned, because what was going through his mind was there are kids dying inside the school. We need as many officers inside to serve, to protect, to make sure that the target is neutralized, and to make sure that they could get the students and teachers to safety, to a hospital where they could render aid. I think one thing is important to note, though, in context, that as this source was saying that they were going into the building and that BSO officers were outside on the scene, while this is an active shooting, Jake, and I think that's important to note. It's not after, when of course we all see when we cover these types of shootings that a perimeter is established. This is seconds after these calls are coming in for help, when students and teachers are calling 911 callers, letting them know that it's an active shooter situation. In those moments is when this source describes that these BSO officers are outside as they are busting in the doors trying to help these students and teachers.
A lot of criticism for Broward County Sheriff's Office and Rosa, not just for how they handled the shooting itself, but for how they handled the months leading up to the shooting. CNN's learned about yet another misread flag in this, someone close to the gunman calling the FBI tip line and told them something is going to happen.
You know, this tipster saying that the suspect was going to explode. Now, as you mentioned, we know about that January 5th FBI call where a tipster calls in. What we didn't know, Jake, were the chilling details, and we're learning some of those chilling details according to the Wall Street Journal. They obtained the transcript of that call, and the individual who called is a person close to the suspect who says that she directed authorities to his Instagram account, and she specifically said that his posts went from "I want to kill myself" to "I want to kill people." The rage was up. She was afraid that this individual could shoot up a school, and said, quote, "I know he's going to explode. Something's going to happen. I just know I have a clear conscience if he takes off and just starts shooting places up." Now, she goes on to describe that he brings in a dead bird into the house and starts cutting the bird, that he dresses up as a ninja and as an ISIS fighter. And Jake, this is the FBI tip, of course, that we've been talking about so much and related to this case, that fell through the cracks. Yet another warning sign of the violence and the potential violence that this suspect could have done. And now here we are covering this massacre in Parkland, Florida.
Horrifying. Rosa Flores in Parkland, thank you so much. The face of the NRA called him a socialist when it comes to gun legislation. So what does New York Governor Andrew
Cancer Care is here. Learn more at cancercenter.com/experts.
And we're back with the politics lead now. In the wake of the massacre in Parkland, Florida's Republican Governor Rick Scott just announced today a plan to try to keep students safe. Scott's proposing raising the age to buy any gun in his state to 21, tougher background checks and longer waiting periods to buy firearms, an end to the sale of bump stocks, which converts semi-automatic weapons to automatic weapons. The governor's proposal also includes giving government more power to place individuals deemed mentally ill in custody, and millions of dollars more in funding for mental health services, as well as fortifying schools. In the northeastern United States, the Democratic governors of Connecticut, New Jersey, New York, and Rhode Island have also announced the formation of a partnership to combat gun violence. Joining me now is one of them, Governor Andrew Cuomo from New York. Governor, always good to see you. Thanks for joining us.
Good to be with you, Jake. Thank you.
So I want to get to your new coalition in a moment, but first, your reaction to these new proposals from Governor Rick Scott of Florida. It seems like something that you might be able to get behind.
Yeah, look, I think there's tremendous political pressure, especially for the people in Florida, understandably. And I have no doubt that they'll propose a series of reforms. I think, frankly, most of them are incremental and won't really be consequential and are more political pandering than anything else. But I think we know what the problem is if we want to be honest. And I think we just have to avoid the temptation to follow the administration's line that brings the discussion down to the absurd. The problem is not guns in schools, right? That's part of the problem. There's shootings in schools, there are shootings in arenas, there are shootings in shopping malls, there are shootings on transportation facilities. So it's not just about schools and fortifying schools. And the answer that the NRA wants to hear is the answer is more guns. The answer isn't more guns. The answer is making sure that people who shouldn't have guns don't have guns.
So strengthening background checks,
you'd be in favor for 20 years.
You'd be in favor of strengthening background checks. What else? I mean, if you consider getting rid of bump stocks or raising the legal purchase age to 21, if you say that's incremental, what's a big sweeping proposal that you think should happen and that you think politically could happen?
Well, forget politically could happen, first of all, okay, because that's a trap. Now you're in the Washington gridlock trap. Well, we got done what we could get done. I understand the legislative process, but I'm not willing to sacrifice for crumbs and incremental baby steps on a national problem that we've been dealing with for decades, and we've gotten absolutely nowhere. Why don't we start by saying what the real problem is and what the real solution is? The real problem is not just schools. It is society-wide. These shootings can happen anywhere USA, anytime. So don't just focus on schools. Number two, it's not about more guns. It's about stopping people from who shouldn't have guns from getting guns. Mentally ill people should not have guns. Dangerous people should not have guns, which means you have to have a real universal background check, which we do not have. We have a background check where if you walk into a store, they run a background check. But if you go to a gun show, they don't have a check. If you buy it privately, they don't have a check. So you need universal background checks. You'd need a real nationwide database of mentally ill people who shouldn't be able to buy a gun and dangerous people who shouldn't be able to buy a gun. You would then need what they call a red flag bill, a mechanism where someone who could report a person who they believe is mentally ill. A teacher believes a student is mentally ill, they can report it to the police. The police can investigate, go to the judge, and put a person on the list.
Right.
And then you would be talking about outlawing unnecessarily dangerous guns, which are assault weapon guns. Well, Jake, 1934, we had little common sense. We outlawed machine guns because they were too dangerous. Why are you allowing the sale of assault weapons today?
Okay, and then the last question, sir. You talk about banning assault weapons. As you know, that is a very curiously defined item. It's not a specific. It was invented for the assault weapons ban during the Clinton years when you were in the Clinton cabinet. Would you be in favor of banning all 2,000 plus semi-automatic weapons that we're talking about here? Would you really want a nationwide ban on that, or are you talking about a more narrowly honed description?
I'm talking about a more narrowly honed description, not a semi-automatic rifle, an assault weapon that is military style, that has a foregrip, that has a 30 round clip. Most police officers have a 10-round clip or a 15-round clip. You know, why didn't that police officer charge into the school? In Florida, when you have a mentally ill person with a 30-round clip on an assault weapon, that is an intimidating force. It's the same logic, Jake, that in 1934 we banned machine guns because they were too dangerous.
Surely you're not excusing the officer who didn't do his job, the school resource officer who did not go into the school during the school shooting.
Of course not. That was his oath, that was his job, that was the protocol after Columbine. But when you start talking about absurd proposals like a teacher should be armed and get a bonus, you're talking about a person with, if they have an assault weapon, a truly dangerous weapon that is more powerful than most weapons that most people have. I don't think you're going to give the teachers assault weapons. And why allow that risk to exist in society? You know there's a chance that the gun is going to fall into the wrong hands. We have 44,000 registered assault weapons just in the state of New York. Any one of those can be stolen at any given time.
Democratic Governor of New York, Andrew Cuomo, always good to see you, sir. Thanks for your time.
Good to see you, Jake.
And we have some more breaking news. We just got word about more charges leveled against Paul Manafort by the special counsel. Stick around.
Last year's ad campaign was a success for Choice Hotels.